Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 11 of Life Lessons in Combat Sports. This is Eric Hamidi, and I got one more addition for you for the April Mania theme that we're going with. I really enjoyed doing these episodes because it's kind of helped me stay consistent with doing the podcast, in addition to also just, I don't know, taking a little bit of time to reflect, because I've often said that doing this podcast has helped me deal with certain things or deal with various things that are going on in my life. And I just feel like, I mean, even today, more so than others is especially true. I mean, just, hell, I was listening to sorry about that. I was listening to an MMA podcast shortly before doing this episode, and hell, I even heard something that one of the hosts said that I was just thinking, damn, that's really something that I could have used growing up. And who knows, maybe that'll be a future episode later on. But I just found it interesting because I don't think it's a perspective that we hear a lot, and also maybe this is something that people can keep in mind, younger generations, just so that way they can live a happier and more fulfilling life. But yeah, I guess with today, it's kind of like, you know, sometimes we just have those days where life hits us hard, and I don't know, for me, coming to this podcast has kind of been that safe haven or that relief, if you will. And that's just something that I really enjoy. I just like that I've looked into the content that I have and done the things that I have and been able to share this kind of information with everybody, because it does a lot and it's fun to do. So with that being said, yes, April Mania comes to a close, so what I decided on was on this. By the time this episode drops, I will have gone to my first event by this wrestling company called Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, and basically they have an event, a pay-per-view called Rebellion on April 25th, and it's a little interesting that this is the first, for a company that's been around since 2002, it's kind of interesting that this is the first event I'm going to of theirs, but that's just the way that it plays out, just because they were mainly an East Coast company, and then I was out of wrestling for 8 years, got back into it, and now finally they're doing an LA show that I can go to. So it should be exciting, should be good. So with that, I decided I'm going to share a life lesson related to the history of Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, TNA Wrestling, because I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. Like I just said a moment ago, they started in 2002, and the way that they came up was that basically it was started by Jerry and Jeff Jarrett, who are these longtime personalities or wrestlers and business people within the wrestling industry. And their whole goal was to fill a void that was left in 2001 with the purchase of WCW by the WWF, and then the bankruptcy of Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW, which eventually their assets, their trademarks, their video library was purchased by the WWE. Those were 2 out of the 3 major wrestling organizations that ceased operations. So a year later, TNA has their first show in 2002, and they have their humble beginnings, if you will, performing in small venues, not really a whole lot of people knowing about them, working out the kinks and all that stuff. And then eventually they get funded by this company called Panda Energy, which helps them keep afloat, helps them keep shows going, and that would be the parent company for TNA for the next damn near 15 years, 14 years, something like that. So it's interesting because the way that I got introduced to this company, I'll never forget this. I was literally, I was at home, and this was in August of 2004. I was at home watching TV, and then I was flipping through the channels, and then I come across Fox Sports Net, and I just see a wrestling ring, and then also Jeff Hardy, who is a well-known wrestler. He's been wrestling since the 90s. He made a name for himself in WWE, and he was actually one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. So I just see a wrestling ring, and then I see Jeff, and I'm like, and I changed the channel, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, what was that? So then I go back, and it immediately caught my eye, because one thing that made them stand out in those days was the fact that they had a 6-sided ring. They didn't have the traditional 4-sided ring. So that really, that really stopped me in my tracks, because that was something I had never seen before, and it just seemed unique or different. And also the fact that it was Jeff Hardy on the program that helped keep my attention. And for the life of me, I have no idea who he wrestled, but from then on out, I knew about the company. So I started watching them, and then basically what happened was that they eventually land a TV deal on what is now known as Paramount Network, but back then it was Spike TV. WWE had their show Monday Night Raw on that channel for about 5 years, and then when that deal ended, TNA took over their spot. So the thing about TNA is that they really grew to be the alternative of the mid to late 2000s, basically being the number 2 wrestling organization, obviously behind WWE. And they were building a name for themselves. Honestly, they were gaining a lot of momentum. I think the things that helped out in their favor was the fact that they had unique match styles. They had that 6-sided ring. They had these high flyers doing these amazing things, and also the stars that were coming into TNA, like and wrestling fans will know Kurt Angle or the Dudley Boys or Sting, for instance, who at that point had never been to WWE. So they were gaining a lot of momentum, and I liked the stuff that they were putting out, and a lot of people liked the stuff that they were putting out as well. They just really became a workhorse organization. It's actually a little funny, because I mentioned how I got started watching TNA wrestling, but then I have another friend of mine who how he started watching it. It's so funny. He said that he was looking in the TV guide, and then he saw listed on there TNA wrestling, and he's like, oh, okay, hey, I'll go check that out. And that got him excited, or all that stuff. So then he tunes in, and then when the show is over, turns it off, and this joke has stuck with me ever since I first heard it. He was like, I turned off the TV, and then I was like, well, not quite the TNA I was hoping for, but I guess this is okay. Oh my God. I swear, when it comes to funny things I've seen related to combat sports, that has stuck with me, along with this meme that I saw where it's at the top of it says, Joe Rogan waiting for an unconscious fighter to wake up after getting knocked out to interview him. And it's like a screenshot of like this character opening his eyes, and there's SpongeBob just waiting there with a microphone that has a UFC flag on it. It's just those two things are some of the funniest things I've seen related to combat sports. So that's his origin story, and then that's I already mentioned how I got into watching the company. So they had something that drew your attention, and then eventually what ends up happening is that in late 2009, Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff joined the company. And just as a quick overview, Eric Bischoff, he was the president, and he helped run WCW as the executive vice president and all that stuff, and Hulk Hogan was part of that company for 6 years. So TNA gets them to join the company, and from there, that kind of leads into a little bit of a dark age, or a dark period for them, because what ended up happening was that the company, the staff at TNA, they brought these two in to try to catapult themselves and take another step further as far as becoming competition to WWE. And honestly, when you look at that whole saga, there's just a lot of differences in management, creative, business pursuits. It even seems like from the get-go, it just was a mess as far as like who TNA wanted, whether or not Hogan wanted to go to the company, and all this other stuff. And they are there for a few years, and then eventually Hogan and Bischoff leaves. And what really happens to the company is that they because they had a lot of ambitious business pursuits that didn't result in a return in investments, and also just the fact that there were creative decisions that were made that sort of went against what the fans wanted, and then also kind of spat in the face of like the people who'd stuck with the company and helped build it what it is. That led to a major exodus of a lot of people. And also another thing that I should add, and just to give an idea of how that return on investment didn't happen, it's because they tried to perform in these larger buildings and these larger venues, but then they weren't getting not enough people were showing up, and the arenas were empty and all that stuff. So that's just an example of things not working out for them, or just how they didn't get a return, like basically how they didn't make up for the amount of money that they were spending. So that's the other thing, is that a lot of these guys who were brought in during this 2009, 2012 timeframe, they cost a lot, and they weren't, I think it was just basically they were losing more money than they were making. So that's why even after Hogan and Bischoff left, that depleted their resources. And it really got down to the point where they were struggling in the mid 2010s, like just with everything that I've mentioned. And it got to a point where literally 2016, I think it was late 2016 or late 2017 where I wasn't entirely back into wrestling, but then I was kind of looking into it, or just kind of in the know about stuff. But yeah, at that time, I really, I would have bet the house that they were going to fold. Just given their struggles, given what they'd been through, the diminished reputation, and just all this other stuff, the loss of money and funding and all that other stuff, I was like, I could have sworn that they were going to go under at that time. And I thought it was just a matter of time until they did. And Jesus, man, it's crazy. So what ends up happening is that Panda Energy no longer owns TNA. In the beginning of 2017, it's bought out by this company called Anthem Sports and Entertainment, and then they rebranded the company to Impact Wrestling. And their struggles still continue, and there was a whole thing in the middle of 2017 where they merged with Global Force Wrestling, another smaller promotion that was run by Jeff Jarrett, and for a time they were known as Global Force Impact, but then there was a whole disagreement and severing of ties. So that kind of led into a little bit of another saga where, I don't know, I guess that sort of hurt the brand of that company, because you sort of, like, at that time, for me, I was just sort of thinking, what is their name? I don't even know, because they're like Impact, and because they changed from TNA to Impact, then to Global Force, and then back to Impact. I'm like, what are you guys called? So I think all of that just played into the struggles that they were having. So at the end of 2017, there's a couple of people who joined the company. Scott D'Amore, Don Callis, they become executive vice presidents of the company, and then over the years they help to repair the name and the reputation of, well, at the time they were known as Impact Wrestling. So they, from what I researched, they put in a lot of work into just repairing the brand, so that way they could have a following and be in the good graces of fans again. So they go by the name Impact Wrestling for a few years, and then in late 2023 they decide, hey, we're going to go back to the TNA wrestling name, because I mean, to be perfectly honest, a lot of companies that they were working with were referring to them as that. And then also they felt like fans had more of an attachment to that name than they ever did with Impact Wrestling. Oh, just to backtrack a little bit, because I forgot to mention this. Another problem that TNA had as far as losing fan interest and just really falling off the totem pole as far as the top wrestling organizations was the fact that I mentioned this before, another wrestling company called All Elite Wrestling. When they announced that they were going to start the running shows in late 2018, and then when they finally started running as an organization in 2019, because of all the resources that the Khan family have, who they own All Elite Wrestling, they own the Jacksonville Jaguars and some soccer teams and stuff like that. So they were able to put a lot of resources into their company, and they actually got a little bit more of a head start than a lot of new organizations would, because they weren't performing in these small venues or these in front of like a couple hundred people. They were performing in like the MGM Grand Garden Arena. They came out guns blazing, and that was just the resource that they had available to them, so they utilized it. And plus there was a lot of demand and interest in having some type of alternative and more of a wrestling focused program than what they were getting with WWE at the time. So it was almost like when AEW started, they automatically became number two even before running another show. And I think that's honestly kind of indicative of just how damaged the TNA brand was and how little of a following and how little fanfare they had. But through the steps that Scott D'Amore and Don Callis do, they eventually work their way up to the point where they do have some momentum on their side, and all of this stuff came to a peak, or not a peak, but it came to a high point in the beginning of 2024 when they went back to that brand name and they were just producing a lot of really good matches, and there was a great turnout for fans, and they were introducing these new titles that got a lot of attention. So that was an exciting time, because it was almost like, wow, and I used to make this joke a lot with people when I would talk about that company, when talking about the Hogan Bischoff era, just thinking, man, they're still trying to recover from that time. But now it just seems like they've worked hard to get back to a good standing of being the number three, possibly, now or in the future being the number two wrestling organization. And there's more interest in the product than there has been in a while. Don Callis left his role as executive vice president. Scott D'Amore becomes the president, and then in the beginning of 2024, his contract is terminated, so he's no longer part of the company. And to be perfectly honest, I kind of feel like that sort of hurt their momentum a little bit, because it almost seemed like at that time there was this renewed interest and they were firing on all cylinders, and then they got rid of Scott D'Amore. I mean, it didn't take away from the fact that in 2024 they had they had quite a bit of a resurgent kind of year, and they were still doing good stuff and still building off of that momentum. So I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that they've lost it, but I just feel like where we are now compared to a year ago, the momentum and the interest is not the same. But that's business for you. So with all that being said, that comes into the life lesson the whole point of this episode. So I'm telling you all this stuff about this company, but what is that showing us? To me, when you look at the history of TNA wrestling, it just seems like the slow and steady approach is what really works. And here is my basis for that. I heard a while ago that things that come easily leave just as easily. And to me, that sort of signifies that if there's no foundation for something, then it can't remain intact. So I think from them going through the things that they did and doing the things they did, and then also having this 20 plus year history of trials and tribulations and all this other stuff, it just sort of shows that if you work at something and you take your time and go with the whole, Rome wasn't built in a day analogy, then you can reach a point of success. I mean, really in anything, in life or in work and all that other stuff. And I suppose another reason why I'm saying this is because, like I just mentioned, AEW, when they started, they had a lot of momentum and they just hit the ground running and got all this interest. But over the last couple years, due to resurgence in WWE's quality of content, just backstage issues and attendance issues and all that stuff, the momentum isn't there for AEW. Like people aren't as interested in it as they were when they first started, and even for a couple years after that. And I mean, I don't really know if it's because they tried really hard to be a competitor right from the get-go. I kind of feel like maybe that played a part in it, that they were trying to rush their success to become the number 2 wrestling organization. So that's how, kind of like what I said just now, as far as when something comes as quickly, it leaves just as easily. Whereas opposed to, if you take the approach that TNA Wrestling did, then you figure out what works, what doesn't work. I mean, I guess this is kind of similar to everything I've been talking about, but I really want to focus on the slow and steady approach, because if you take that approach, then not only does it combine the things that I've kind of been talking about this entire month as far as figuring out what works for you and all that stuff, but I think what also helps is that it develops the ability for you to endure and know how to go endure tough times or what have you. I mean, I'm no building expert, but I kind of relate it to the fact that if you're building a house and you're building an office building, if there's no foundation there, then it's not going to stay and it will fall apart. And I don't know if maybe that's what's happening with AEW, is that they couldn't work out all the kinks because they wanted to get to such a head start. But it wouldn't surprise me if that was an issue, or if that was a factor. Now, that's not to say that TNA Wrestling never did that stuff too. I mean, when they were coming up from 2002 to 2009, yeah, they slowly built their way up. But, they made some mistakes along the way too, and they kind of tried to be too much of a competitor to WWE too soon, where it's like, it's not going to happen in a quick time frame. So I think how that kind of ties in is that when you have TNA in the mid 2010s with the damaged reputation that it does, and they need to get back to a place of prominence or some type of success, I mean, it's easy to kind of get deterred and think, oh, this is going to take so long, or just how are we going to build our way there? But I guess the whole idea of trusting the process, that's what helps that. I mean, having that faith in the process and understanding it's going to take time. I mean, maybe that's the mentality that Scott D'Amore had, and that's what got them through the tough times. Now, something I do want to point out is that, yes, in some ways they took the slow and steady approach to try to build their way up, but it's not just that leads into success overall. And I was just thinking about this yesterday or earlier today, is that you can take the slow and steady approach, but you still have to put in the work. That's a big thing. It's not like you can just say, oh, I'm gonna, take my time with this and it'll just happen. That's kind of a more passive approach. It's more along the lines of, okay, in terms of building your way up to something, you also have to put in the work. You also have to make the right decisions. You still have to analyze what works for you. And I guess like what I'm trying to get at is that even though this is probably a more sustainable approach and also a better way to just stick around with something, there's a lot of other factors that come into play here. And hell, TNA, they had something like that back in the mid 2000s, because I'm talking about how they had a television deal with Spike TV. So their show was called Impact. And when you look at the progression of that show, I mean, honestly, that's kind of symbolizing everything that I'm talking about here, where it's like, okay, first they start out as a Friday afternoon show. Okay, that's where they started on Fox Sports. Then they went without a TV deal for a few months after their contract with them expired in May of 2005. So they land on Spike TV in October of 2005. So where they started was a Friday afternoon show, to having no TV deal, to having a Saturday time slot at 11 o'clock at night, to a Thursday slot at 11 o'clock at night, to a Thursday primetime spot. They got their show to be on at 9 p.m. on Thursdays, and then finally getting another hour to their show. So you see, there's the step-by-step process. I guess how I sort of relay that to my own experiences is that, I mean, if we look at this podcast, for instance, I'm trying to take that same approach of trying to build to something. And maybe, honestly, doing this episode is a little self-reflective for me, that I do have to understand that in addition to doing the things that I like, or kind of leaning into the things that I like to do or that I want to do, I also have to understand that this is going to take time. But at the same, on that same note, there's other things I'm doing as far as taking the chance and starting up this podcast, or just not waiting around for something. And I think that is also reflective in the sense of, like, I just started, so we're not going to be a big time podcast right now, but the goal is to eventually become that. And who knows, maybe if I just keep trucking along, then that'll end up happening. I mean, hell, if you look at even just other public figures, their road to success, I mean, I feel like I definitely talked about it in the last episode when talking about Kane and giving all those examples, but their success is not overnight either. And I don't think it's realistic for us as people to think that whatever kind of thing that we're pursuing is going to become an overnight success, or that it's going to come quickly. That's probably a better way to describe it. And I don't know, I'm talking about like work pursuits or just professional endeavors, but I think it also kind of comes down to personal matters, in the sense that if there's certain things about, I guess, my personality that I would like to improve on, it's kind of like it's going to take time, but also the effort has to be there. So that's something I'm trying to be a little bit more mindful of and to actually do. But I think, honestly, this resurgence of TNA wrestling, it's a perfect example of how it takes time. It takes time to build to something and to create something. I mean, what's that age-old analogy? It's easier to destroy than it is to create. And there's a lot of truth to that. So I'm interested to see where this company goes and what happens in the rest of 2005. I'm interested to see where this company goes and what happens to this company as 2025 rolls along. It will be interesting to see if they can build up on that momentum and develop more of a following, or get a better TV deal that's more widespread, or just having some of that same excitement that they had in the beginning of 2024. We'll see what happens with that. But this is an important thing I wanted to mention. I really thought about it, and I thought it would be good for me to share this with you guys. And you know, maybe that can shed some light onto you guys as far as like, hey, this little wrestling company, it teaches us how we should go about our lives, or how we should approach it, and what we should think about. I mean, because when I think about it, this company has been around for a long time, and there have been plenty of other wrestling companies who started either around the time that TNA started or after, and they're not even around anymore. And I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that. I mean, I'm not going to say that, oh, they had the wrong approach. It's just not everything works out. And certainly with TNA's history, I mean, there were a lot of moments where they almost went under. But I think that resiliency, and just like the fact that they've survived long enough, shows us that this is an important lesson that works. Honestly, I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. But yeah, hopefully this kind of shed some light, or kind of demonstrated some things that maybe you weren't considering or that you thought about before. But in any event, that's going to be episode 11, which concludes April Mania. And I was thinking about this. I've been focusing a lot on professional wrestling these last several episodes. I mean, not just with the month of April, but also just the fact that when I had that videography gig and I took a few weeks off, the last episode I did was on Bret Hart and Rick Rude. So it's like, I've been doing a lot of wrestling episodes. But you know what? We're going to change that. So if you're longing for some MMA content, don't worry, I got you covered, because we're doing a theme next month, and I'm calling it MMA. Yeah, all mixed martial arts related episodes about fighters or events or topics. Get ready. It's going to be exciting, and I'm really happy about this next month that's coming up. So yeah, with that being said, thank you guys for your time. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section, and also give me a follow on Instagram, Life and Combat Sports, and we'll talk again soon. Catch you guys on the next one. See ya.